Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
The image on the screen captures in a way that my lecture can never do the argument I want to develop today. On the left is the Angelus Novus of Paul Klee in 1919. On the right is Anselm Kieffer's birdsong, currently on display in White Cube, Bermondsey, as part of his latest exhibition. The first is the Angel of History with a face. The second is the Angel of History, faceless. My subject is the effacement of war in the 20th century. And in painting, sculpture, and installation art in many parts of the world today, war is no longer configured through the human face. In part, this is a reflection of internal changes in the arts, but in part is a reflection of the changing nature of war itself. In 1914, war had a human face, the face of the generation of soldiers who fought and died on the battlefields of the Great War. But over time, the faces of those who have fought war, and at times of those who have become its victims, have faded from view. The way many of us see war today, I believe, is very different from the way men and women of 1914-18 saw it. And since what we see matters much more than what we read, it is of some importance to trace the nature and consequences of this flight from figuration, this occlusion of the human form and face in representations of war in the 20th century and beyond. Now, in part, what we have witnessed is the braiding together of war with terror over the past 3 generations. To be sure, this is in no sense a 20th century innovation. Goya's Disasters of War hardly left anything about human cruelty to the imagination, and the art of photography accompanied both Sherman's March to the Sea in the American Civil War and the bloody suppression of the Boxer Rebellion in China at the turn of the century. What the visual arts were able to convey in the 20th century were central shifts in the targets of war and in its killing power. The terror in total war rests in part on the industrialization of violence, and in part on the fact that the reach of the state was greater than ever before in 1914. Consequently, in wartime, nobody was safe. After 1914, a new kind of assembly line destruction emerged, mixing high explosive shells, poison gas, and by the 1930s, air power, as well as toxic forms of ideology and deadly amalgams. As a result, war and mass terror became virtually synonymous in the 1930s. The nature and rules of war itself shifted in significant ways, too. In 1914-18, the rules of engagement on the battlefield changed. Gas warfare is in part responsible for that. In the interwar years, the bombing of civilian targets became for the first time a centerpiece of armed conflict. After 1941, genocide became an integral part, some would say the defining part, of the war the Nazis waged. In each case, though in different ways, terror became the unavoidable face of war. And artists were there to configure it, to give terror a face, a name, and a place. In this lecture, I want to sketch some of the ways artists created enduring representations of the 20th century degeneration of warfare into inescapable terror. The individuals whose work I focus on in particular are these 3, Otto Dix, Pablo Picasso, and Anselm Kieffer, though I will refer to other individuals and forms of configuration as well. Now, these artists are very well known. There's a giant literature on all of them. But putting them together may help us see more clearly both the changing link between history and terror and the changing strategies of configuring war over the past century captured in this one image. In all of the literature on Klee and on Kieffer, on contemporary art, I've not found a study which points to the conversation between today's Anselm Kieffer and yesterday's Paul Klee. I urge you to think of it and think of the implications of their dialogue. Now, the evolution of visual representations of war, as opposed to the evolution of writing about war, my subject last week, shows us how images change when targets change, or if you will, when victims change. In the Great War, terror had a face, and it was primarily that of the soldier. There were tens of millions of victims, but the ones to receive iconic status both during the conflict and in its aftermath were the men at the front. There were other nominees we could name, to be sure. The victims of the Armenian genocide were there. But the political conflict over their treatment went on, it still goes on, and made their genocidal fate contested terrain. No one doubted at the time that the enduring images of industrial killing in the 1418 war returned again and again to the men in the trenches, the men we still call the lost generation. Aerial bombardment came to both Europe and the world with a vengeance in the 1930s. Both the Japanese and the Italians used poison gas in warfare in China and in Ethiopia, but it was aerial bombardment in Europe which presented another enduring set of images, this time of the plight of innocents in wartime waiting for the bombs to drop. Here the iconic figures were civilians, townspeople, farmers, and their animals under indiscriminate and devastating bombardment from the air. Their terror is the moment before their destruction. When we turn to the 1939-45 war, any interrogation of the linkage between war, terror, and history must consider the Holocaust. And over time, the Holocaust has come to occupy a larger and larger place within the history of the Second World War. Still, the Shoah was by no means the only wartime instance of mass murder and butchery of people, not for what they did, but for who they were. The rape of Nanjing in 1937, the Ustasha-led genocide in Yugoslavia both deserve our attention here, as does the terror induced by conventional, inverted commas, firebombing of Tokyo or Dresden, or the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These acts of war unleashed a debate about the use of terror which echoes down to our own times. So my first point is a simple one. As war changed, so did its artistic configurations. The second point I want to make is more formal in character. That is, when we move from the Great War to the interwar years and then to the Second World War, we can see that the partial occlusion of the human face in the configuration of terror is one of the most striking features of changing European representations of war. And here I do want to exclude other parts of the world. This is a series of comments on a restricted zone of representation, not to be understood as representing all of the world. I do want to provincialize the European representations of war, but not to eliminate them. There are exceptions, of course, but on balance, the move I try to document in this lecture is one away from a naturalistic representation of the human face and figure in representations of war. Thus, the images in Otto Dix's great war paintings done from 1914 to 1940 are still life-size and identifiably human, though the soldiers so represented faced monumental terror and horror on the field of battle. The terror of the victims of the destruction of Guernica in Picasso's painting is inscribed in part in facial features and in part in the cruciform and symbolic elements of the ensemble. In contrast, there is a much more complex set of choices in artistic representations of the Second World War in general and of the Holocaust in particular. There have been many non-figurative images used metonymically to stand for the monstrous whole. Many representations of the organized destruction of synagogues in Germany in November 1938, as I shall show you, are void of figures. This was true of much, though not all, photography at the time. It remains true in later representations of this iconic act, as in the case of Kieffer's The Breaking of the Vessels, to which I will return in a minute, and his more recent birdsong. The other title is Sprache der Vogel, the sound of birds, the voice of birds. A different set of problems emerged when artists approached the task of representing the emptying of an entire world, the Jewish world of Central and Eastern Europe, an entire population, its language, its culture, its presence now almost entirely gone. The dimensions of this, the essential victory registered by Hitler, are in their magnitude certainly terrifying. And yet this terror has been made visceral, first in art by portraiture, in prose and poetry, and then later, perhaps much later, by the effacement of figuration itself. Consider first the face of Anne Frank on her published diary, or her conventional, at times sanitized representation on the stage and in film as at one end of the spectrum. Then consider, interestingly, there are 12 different translations I've looked at of Anne Frank. They all have her face on it. Primo Levi's great work, If This Be a Man, is translated into more. Of the 15 translations that I have sought, one has his face on it. All the others are abstract. Of course, there is an array of configuration between the two, but my point is that this flight from figuration is not particularly evident in the case of the Great War or of warfare in the 1930s. only after the Second World War, and maybe because of the Holocaust in the Second World War, did abstraction come into its own as an indispensable way of representing the links between war, terror, and history. Another way of putting the point is this: putting a human face on the Holocaust may be an impossibility, not because the crime was indescribable or beyond language, but because its enormity seems to have undermined certain currents of humanistic thinking which return time and again to the face as the source of our knowledge of ourselves and others. Look at a Rembrandt self-portrait, and you will immediately see what I mean. Try this one, Emmanuel Levinas's phrasing of the issue. The face, Levinas writes, a thing among other things, pierces the frailty of our existence. The face speaks to me and thereby invites me into a relationship with another, a relationship without parallel, leading either to fulfillment or to recognition, unquote. The Holocaust erased or blotted out that face, that relationship, that recognition. In that sense, it had no face, and hence no meaning. Facelessness is a language of post-Holocaust art. I want to offer a snapshot of my interpretation in the juxtaposition of the two works of art you see in front of you now, Paul Klee, 1919, Anselm Kieffer, 2012. My argument is captured here, and I'm tempted simply to stop and ask for questions. They said it all. In what follows, my aim is to trace the shift from Klee's Angel of History to Kieffer's Birdsong. The contrast in front of us reinforces my claim that over the past century, war has had a history in the visual arts and in the arts of representation just as much as it does in the very material and lethal practices of organized violence. I want to offer a few thoughts on this matter and suggest that alongside generals, artists know something about war too. In contrast to the terror of trench warfare in 1914-18, or the destruction of towns and ordinary people under the bombers of the interwar years, there emerged a different kind of non-figurative configuration of war and terror after Auschwitz. And yet the human face, that profile of which Primo Levi asked us to consider if this be a man, did not vanish completely. It was effaced. But if conventional figuration seemed inadequate to the task at hand, many jurists, survivors, artists, and healers turned to a different kind of portraiture, to a different field of force, this time one with voices attached to them. Conjuring up the Holocaust has turned to the human voice more and more in an effort to capture the shape and sentiment of the 6 million who vanished during the Shoah and of the men and women who survived the slaughter. Voices are speech acts to which we attach faces, as any radio listener will attest. To be sure, the contrast between figuration before Auschwitz and alternative auditory configurations after needs to be qualified and nuanced. It is what the French call a piste. Cultural history is always messier than that. The images of grotesquely joined piles of corpses being shifted into mass graves by bulldozers were captured by British and American troops almost immediately after the liberation of the camps. Thereafter, the faces of skeletal prisoners in striped uniforms were seared into our minds, and alongside other images, in instance of children surrendering from the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto, these portraits and extremists informed and still inform our sense of the terror of the Shoah. I'm deliberately putting aside documentary photography as a genre worthy of its own investigation. A more precise way of putting the point is to say that the Shoah made ambiguous a return to the human face as a metonym for mass suffering, as occurred in art dedicated to capturing some sense of the terror of war in 1914-18 or in the interwar years. Instead, representations of the terror of the Holocaust describe a house of many mansions, most of them ruined. Some employed figuration, for example, in René's 1955 cinema masterpiece, Nuit et Brouillard, in the close-up photography and voices of Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, and in the video portraits preserved in Holocaust survivors' archives around the world. They recaptured the face of terror, sometimes in the faces of those who survived it, but more frequently in the voices of those who survived. At the same time, other artists have used more abstract metonyms or gestures toward the terror in the arts of ruins. Here, Kieffer is a central figure of what James Young has termed anti-monuments, those which fall apart or disappear. By the way, a number of Kieffer's works in the current White Cube exhibition literally have chemicals splashed onto the canvases that fall off and are part of the art itself. Its own decomposition is part of the narrative that the artist is attempting to bring us with him. Now, choosing Kieffer is problematic in another sense, in that he was born as I was in 1945, just a few days after I was born, and his work is filtered through later German history as much as it bears witness to the terror of the Holocaust. But one of the features of the representational universe surrounding the Shoah is its slow transformation over the second half of the 20th century and beyond. We need to go well beyond 1945 to see this phenomenon clearly, and I think it is the clearest I've ever seen it in the White Cube exhibition currently on display in London. What may be termed a latency period, when the faces and voices of the survivors were occluded, for instance, in the Nuremberg trials, they returned into our auditory and visual fields later, after the Eichmann trial and in the 1970s and after. Voices, after the 70s, had listeners, an audience that has grown exponentially. Primo Levi's masterpiece, If This Be a Man, written in 1947, sold 1,500 copies and then was pulped. It was reprinted in 1957 and later captured an exponentially growing reading public. Since the 1970s, it has appeared in 38 translations and is clearly an international bestseller. Why people want to hear a voice at one moment and not another is a central question I want to address. One answer is that over time, memory became tied up to law, and both became performative. The witness has a voice, and the witness demands to be heard. She testifies. Another answer is that the emergence of the Holocaust witness coincided with the rebirth of human rights as the signature of the European experiment. It was a coincidence, to be sure, but through the Helsinki Accords, international agreements guaranteeing the western borders of the Soviet Union, and since the mid-1970s, Human Rights Watch and other groups earned the right to survey, hear, listen to the voices of Soviet dissidents, the voices of members of Charter 77 in Prague, and other voices around the world. Which is cause and which is effect is hard to say. Both Holocaust testimony and human rights activism were acts of witnessing, and powerful acts at that. We need to note that technical change really makes a difference, though of a facilitating rather than a creative kind. Over the same years, and it's important to remember this, audio cassettes were complemented, finally, by cheap video cassettes and recording technology, and both were amplified by the internet in their ability to preserve the voices and faces of witnesses of all kinds. This lecture will be on the internet tomorrow. This is astonishing for someone who started practicing history in this university in the 1960s. The impulse is there, the audience is there, and the new technology of the 1970s and 80s brought them together, and they remain there to this day. A quick caveat or two at the beginning. I am making some daring statements, I think, here, and I invite contestation. The distinction I make between privileging the voice and privileging the face in representations of terror is really a heuristic one. Both have had their place. They have to be there in representations of war and terror. Still, I have an instinct, and the older I get, the more I follow my instinct in historical work. And the instinct is to say that there has been a change in the sense that voices matter more now, after the end of the 20th century than at the beginning. The cry of wounded men on the Somme is something we can never hear. The British government propaganda film of the Battle of the Somme, seen by perhaps 2 million people, 10% of the population, in 1916, was silent. The drone of the bombers or the voices of those under the Condor Legion's attack on Guernica are not available to us. But the voices of those who went through the camps and, in the words of Jeremiah, became Amsri de Charev, those who came out of the slaughterhouse alive, those voices are with us. They are powerful and perhaps unique. I want to suggest that auditory commemoration is now an art form. It has now developed in museums and archives and films on the internet, in the courtroom, as a complex complement to the earlier facial and figurative representation of terror in wartime. We now hear what war and terror were and are, and perhaps through seeing it, and through hearing it, in a way we can see it or imagine it better too. What we hear, after all, when affect is attached to a voice, configures visual images in very powerful ways. I'm reminded of the remark of the great British journalist Alastair Cook, whose letter to America was broadcast on BBC Radio every Sunday morning for 40 years after the 9 o'clock news. He was asked one day why he preferred to work in radio. His answer was that the pictures were better. Now, the second caveat is that we must resist a form of contextual reductionism in understanding the visual arts. They have their own rules, rhythms, Their autonomous unfolding can never be reduced to a mechanical process in which superstructure follows base as night follows day. Still, I don't believe we should reify the arts either, as if those who produce them live in a cocoon until that moment when they emerge as beautiful creatures and fly on their own. They are among us. They speak to us and with us. The third caveat is this. I can only refer to the most cursory fashion to a field much larger than my capacity to analyze it. All I want to suggest in a preliminary manner is that capturing not the faces but the voices of the survivors has become one essential way of making present in our lives the catastrophic encounter of war, terror, and history on which we reflect today. I believe, as I said, that my claim is true not everywhere, but in some places. The distinction to which I point is most clearly visible in Europe East, or Europe west of the Elbe, I'll say. Heroic histories and images, fully visible and figurative, dominated the Soviet Empire until its collapse in 1991. The figuration of war and the victims of war has not faded in Poland, Russia, the Ukraine, elsewhere in the intervening decades, nor has it diminished in parts of the United States or Australia where the face of the soldier, past and present, is a very popular point of reference. The purchase of my argument is strongest, I believe, in West and Central Europe, where the European Union has grown precisely at a time when the presence and political and cultural significance of the military has radically diminished. When James Sheehan asked in the title of A History of 20th Century Europe recently, "Where have all the soldiers gone?" following Lily Marlene, he was making a statement cultural historians need to attend to more and more as time goes by. Well, let me turn to the first artist I want to refer to. All art is a form of mediation, and the notion that experience is captured in some pristine form by the artist is a conceit long since repudiated by producers and consumers alike. Images of horror are mediated images, and to show the differences in such mediation is to do much to unfold some of the differences of early and later 19th century images of terror and war. The mediation I shall turn to in my third lecture is that of film. But now, the visual arts and installation art is my subject. And I want to start by referring to Otto Dix's etchings of the First World War. Dix served on the Somme in 1916 and Champagne in 1917, where he was wounded 3 times, and on the Russian front. This is a self-portrait in the town of Péronne on the Somme, town I've gotten to know very well as one of the group of people who built a museum of the history of the First World War where he fought. As a non-commissioned officer, machine gunner, he saw some of the worst fighting of the war. When in 1924 he sought to return to this landscape, he did not do so simply by painting. He did so through photography. In other words, he used photographs as a mesh, as a screen through which to refract his memories of war. Why this distanciation? In part, it was the heaviness of personal memory. Mediation is necessary because of the sheer emotional, overwhelming avalanche of feelings that are attached to service and war. Like many other veterans, Dix was haunted by images of trench warfare. He spoke a recurrent nightmare in which he crawled through the destroyed houses in which he had fought forever. He never lost sight of the fact that living in the front lines was like living in a noisy, filthy maze. He had volunteered in 1914, but quickly lost his youthful illusions about military service, which is part of what I see in his face in front of you. He painted the face of war, and then he found out how mistaken he was about it. Already inclined to mythical and decadent themes prior to the war, he found on the Western Front a diabolical landscape beyond his worst imaginings. He summed up his experience of trench life in these words in his diary in 1916. Lice, rats, barbed wire, fleas, shells, bombs, underground caves, corpses, blood, liquor, mice, cats, artillery, filth, bullets, mortars, fire, steel. That is what war is. It is the work of the devil. Now, the work of the devil was visible in many of the images that he painted, and the range of horrors he provided was evident. In this figure, along with the next, it is living with the dead. Indeed, it is the fact that the living begin to resemble the dead and the dead begin to resemble the living. And the distinction between the two is not in the least evident. These individuals are sliding in an avalanche down a hill near Péronne, totally covered in mud. And you can see I think you will see. On the left side, I'll have to go down here to show you down below, the distinction between the living and the dead of those who are sliding from left to right in this particular lithograph. All of these, by the way, are from his collection called Der Krieg in 1924 that can be seen in the Historia de la Grande Guerre in Péronne. This is a fascinating part of the series, in part because of its direct attempt to integrate into the iconography of war some images from the German Renaissance. There are images, if I can get around it, that directly recall the Isenheim altarpiece of Grunewald and other works that Dix deliberately imitated, and that the attempt, I think, to try to establish this kind of iconography of war makes it very harder to see where the human face is in the landscape. Whereas any of you who've been to Colmar to see the Isenheim altarpiece will see the astonishing and green, pockmarked body of the Christ. This is one of the images that I think indicates the questioning of how do you use the human face in representations of terror. Let's see if I can do this. Yes. One of the configurations of the human face, which was best known in the First World War, is the gas mask-covered faces of stormtroopers and the unmasked and unhinged faces of trench soldiers who had to be, as it were, treated after exposure to gas warfare. This is a soldier who couldn't get his gas mask on in time. And again, I think that Dix and many other expressionists obviously used exaggerated forms of the human face in order to organize the spatiality of terror. We can see in a difficult manner a figure whom Dix said was a mixture of one of his soldiers in his unit and a small boy who had wandered. Péronne was a farming town, it still is a farming town, who had wandered into the trenches. By the way, do you see possible angelic figures here? There are all kinds of images that I think have meaning in the overall iconography of war in the 20th century that are interrogations of the balance between the human face and conventional images of the sacred. Here again is a Monumento Mori from the series Der Krieg, very much using Hans Holbein and other of the masters of the German Renaissance as the source of his iconography. And here I think is something of the Neue Sachlichkeit, the sort of cold sobriety of seeing a wounded soldier being brought back by men who are perhaps almost as wounded as he is. They all wear, the front and the rear soldier have crutches. Which one is the more wounded is not possible to estimate. And this, of course, is another image of a figure of death being put in a pose that soldiers from Dix's diary like to do. They like to have the comic uncanny, the grotesque of war, being hanging your water can on a corpse's arm sticking out of the trench. That is very much part of the landscape of battle. And in addition, extraordinary images of the animals with which they fought and the suffering of them. Here, by the way, is something that soldiers wrote about all the time, is the horrifying cries of animals wounded in the process of suffering just as men did. And these two are not at all absent from the works of Otto Dix. Another of his images is, again, very complex. And here, I really wonder, I thought a lot about this, to think whether Picasso had some of this in mind when he did the Guernica. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the concept of chaos, the human face organizes space, but the battlefield has no vanishing point. The battlefield is chaos. And the balance in the art of the First World War is to place the human face in a field of chaos and organize, as it were, the visual representation of war in that way. Here is one where the face is really not essential, and some of the figures, again, I'm just asking you to bear these in mind. Some of the figures have resemblances to Picasso's work later on that I'll turn to in a moment or two. This is civilians in German-occupied northern France. Again, the faces of women and children being bombed by British pilots is the centerpiece of this disorganized space. The field of faces is at the bottom of the image, whereas the action is happening on the top. So the dialogue is between the terrified civilians at the bottom and the British plane that is swooping low over the village, presumably with bombs, which indeed did happen at the top. And the final image of what I call the disfigurement of war and the way to effacement is les gueules cassées in French, the men with the broken faces. This is a man after 8 operations to return his human face to him. What happened with high artillery bombardment, shrapnel, and other forms of explosives are shards of metal that would shear off those elements of a human face that make it human. The nose, the lips, the mouth, the jaw, the ear. And this is a man restored to some semblance of a human face that would not terrify children on the street. It seems to me that this is one of the absolutely standard images of transplantation of the human face as one of the effects of the industrialized killing in the First World War. Now, once more, the notion of the human face as the measure of terror seems to me to be made explicit in this one lithograph. Of course, it extended from the living to the dead, from the mad to the mutilated. If we do not look at the face of the soldier, the mutilated soldier, we don't know anything about war, nor do we know anything about the terror it spread among the millions of men who endured it. And just as one footnote to see the significance of this kind of image, Georges Clemenceau, on the 28th of June, 1919, at the signing of the peace treaty in which the German delegation was forced to take it or leave it, no negotiations at all. The German delegation was literally frog-marched into the Hall of Mirrors. And when the door was opened to the 500 delegates from all the victorious powers, waiting for them to go through the choreography of humiliation and defeat, what they saw were 6 men just like this. They saw the gueules cassées, the men with broken faces, as a way of pointing. This is what you Germans brought to the world. It was their faces that stood for the terror of war and for the need, indeed, to blame someone for this abomination that individual men had to suffer. All right, in many ways I want to suggest to you, and I did use the airplane in the selection of the 53 etchings on war called Der Krieg, I want to suggest that war and terror redefined by technology in the interwar years. That is, the emergence of the bomber, capable of reaching any city in Europe with a load of explosives, made the terror of war move from trenches to cities. And Stanley Baldwin was right when he asserted that the bomber will always get through. From 1936 on, the notion circulated widely that the outbreak of war in Europe was bound to mean civilian deaths on a hitherto unknown scale, and that the very first day of the war would be one of mass casualties in most of the many cities of Europe. It seems to me impossible to understand appeasement unless you realize that recognition. Of course, except in Warsaw, Antwerp, that catastrophe didn't happen until later. Nonetheless, its contours were already very well known. Now, in part, that shift of the image of terror from trenches to cities was a function of newsreels. Dix used photographs to mediate his memories. Picasso used newsreels. When newsreels brought the facts of war to millions virtually at the same moment that the violence happened, I think that Picasso saw it the day after the bombing. That is to say, it was very fast, very, very fast. The news that this had happened was brought to France, to Paris, and other parts of the world. Art mediated by newsreels provided us one of the great iconic images of war. And of course, we all have to think about the meaning of the Guernica when we talk about the face of war in the 20th century. It was painted in a fever. If you imagine how many years it's taken to think of how to construct something that might be an appropriate monument to the World Trade Center in New York, whatever. He did it in 4 weeks. He just did it basically in the flash of insight of genius. And it was what contemporaries termed terror bombing that he was trying to capture, the purpose of which was not to move the line to the advantage of one side or the other, but to destroy the lives of non-combatants and to terrify other civilians into bringing war to an end. Of course, the obliteration of the distinction between civilian and military targets had begun in 1914, when Belgian and French civilians were targeted or executed by German troops. This degeneration of the rules of warfare was evident in the case of Russian atrocities in Galicia in 1915 and of course in the Armenian genocide, two in the same year. Picasso's Guernica, though, refers to air power, which transformed the face of war and began to change the way the human face itself was represented in the visual arts. It is probably in front of you, what is probably the most celebrated and maybe the most circulated image of war in the 20th century is in front of you now. Attention to its configuration can tell us much about configurations of terror in the time when death came from the skies. The composition is marked, even framed, by newsprint, which you can see, at least I hope you can see, in the center of the composition. And by the black and white of newsreels. These are two clusters of faces. The reason it's in black and white is because of the newsreel that Picasso saw when he imagined the horror of the moment. Then consider the clusters of faces. There are three on the right, terrified faces of people moving to the center of the scene. Three on the left are victims. One man, possibly a soldier with a broken sword, is prostrate, indeed cruciform in shape, on the bottom left of the image. There is as well a frozen cry on his face. His eyes still see, but not those of the child to his left. His dead body is cradled by his mother. In the center are two animals, the immutable taureau and a terrified horse, above which an electric eye shimmers. I've spent an awful lot of time thinking about that light bulb and determined over time, using Occam's razor, that despite the large literature on its symbolic reference, and there is a very large literature to it, that light bulb is a light bulb. And I want to say that it is a light bulb drawing ironic attention to the power of electricity to deliver terror from the air. Now, why is it ironic? It's ironic because of this. This is the biggest painting ever painted. It's pharaonic in scale. It's Raoul Dufy's La Fée Électricité, the spirit of electricity, painted just before the Guernica by Dufy to show the cornucopia of bounty that electricity brings to humanity. And it is in front of this extraordinary painting, which, by the way, has ranks of 99 French men of science and Marie Curie, showing what it is that science can do for humanity. It's this extraordinary mystification in pastel colors by Dufy, who was an artist that Picasso could not stand, for a whole series of reasons I think we can add, which inspired the light bulb. The 1937 Expo turned Paris into La Ville Illuminée, the city of illuminations. It was 300 years after Descartes, 100 years after the beginning of the railroad session, and so on. And the city itself was turned into an extraordinary electrified city at the very moment of the TVA and the Soviet, as it were, sloganizing of electrification and collective farms equals communism, all of that. The electricity had, shall we say, a cachet in the mid-1930s. And in front of this image, Walter Benjamin stood and framed his seventh thesis on the philosophy of history, that there is no monument to civilization which is not at the same time a monument to barbarism. The electric light bulb is the electricity of terror, and it is not the eye of the human face. That's the point that I want you to consider. It's something dehumanized. It is killing through air power at distant, where the face of the victim and the face of the killer are separated through science. I think Picasso, of course, was an artist of angular planes, of body parts decomposed, or rather recomposed to express something figurative art could no longer employ. And I prefer to ask you to consider Picasso as a liminal figure in which configurations of terror are visible, but not in this kind of composition Otto Dix and his contemporaries knew. Both Dix and Picasso constructed images of terror mediated by prior visual images. Photos for Dix, newsreels for Picasso. The question I want to pose today is, how were the horrors of the Second World War configured in contrast to the two artists I've already considered? And my response is a mixed one. There were conventional and figurative images of war and genocide, of course, but what we see in the art of terror, which followed the Second World War and the Holocaust, is a set of images in which I put to you the human figure is either absent or marginal. And here is the third part of my lecture today. I want to probe this problem not in the spirit of definitive scholarship, but as a tentative step towards framing an argument that cannot, by definition, be definitive. Why not? Because the more we look at the Holocaust, the less we tend to see. This is a claim made by the Australian historian Inga Clendinnen, and it is one I want to explore with you today. By this claim, I do not mean that we miss the traces or cannot find sites of remembrance. On the contrary, they're not hard to find. My claim is rather that when we see the topography of terror, we see elements of a story, the full contours of which tend to escape us. Metaphors seem to lack their conventional power, as to a degree did photographs. Human faces and bodies predominated in photos immediately after the war. And what's extraordinary about them, this is Mauthausen, for instance, is most of them are staged. They're staged to show the victors liberating the victims of war. Here's another one in which, again, British soldiers brought together concentration camp victims in a pose to indicate as it were, the dignity of liberation. I'm not sure anyone asked any of these individuals whether they wanted to be photographed or what it is, indeed, that they thought was happening to them at the time. Now, there are images, therefore. There are faces that we need to see before we look at the effacement of war. One of them is this extraordinary film I referred to before, Alain René's Nuit et Brouillard, released in 1955. In Night and Fog, René worked with two survivors, Jean Cayrol, who wrote the script, and Hans Eisler, who composed the music. René aimed at a kind of desolate tranquility in his presentation of the landscape of terror, but he ran into censorship problems. When he showed the faces of French policemen guarding Jewish deportees on their way to Drancy, in order to get the film Nuit et Brouillard commercially shown, René had to efface the policemen so that no one in the audience could see the French képi in the film and know that it was a French policeman and not a German soldier who did it. Thus, French responsibility for that particular moment in the Shoah had to be effaced. Now, I want to use this instance of effacement to raise a more general point about the representation of war and terror after the Holocaust. Again, my claim is not, oh, how nice. My claim is not that the Holocaust is beyond representation. It is rather that the focus on the single human face, so striking in Dix, in many other war artists, and in different and liminal ways in Picasso, is missing in what we now term Holocaust art. Yes, this in part reflects movement towards abstraction and towards conceptual art, but it may also be a statement of puzzlement on the... How interesting. That's one form of effacement, isn't it? Yes. Thank you. I want to suggest that there's a kind of puzzlement on the part of artists about how to represent the human face when representing the Holocaust. It's a puzzlement. It's a question without a single or a simple solution. And I want to explore this point with respect to the work of Anselm Kieffer and make some references to the architecture of Daniel Libeskind, who followed him. The reason for doing so is both their standing in the world of art and architecture, as well as what I would like to term their self-defined strategy of effacement in representing the Holocaust. We know that 9 million men died in active military service during the First World War, but no one, to my knowledge, tried to represent this immense absence through what I have termed effacement, or perhaps more similarly stated, through making us aware of this vast disappearing act called war by making the human face disappear from the canvases. Or just think for a moment about the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. It's not someone who doesn't have a face, it's someone who we don't know who he is, who had a face at one particular time. It's not that. After the Second World War, we're talking about a different problem. During the Spanish Civil War and its aftermath, millions of men and women died. One estimate has it that over 1 million Republicans died after the end of the fighting. And yet our images of the war are still figurative, visual, and would term for purposes of argument facial. Even Dix's art of disfigurement draws us back to the human face. For a host of reasons, many artists came separately to the conclusion that what happened thereafter in Germany and throughout Europe was not possible to configure, if I can decompose the term. Instead, and with its own dynamics, abstraction took the place of the human form. Let me show you how this operates in the work first of Kieffer and then a touch of Libeskind, although I won't have much time to do that. As I said, Kieffer is my generation. Simon Schama was also born 2 days after me. Kieffer was educated in Dusseldorf. He encountered the circle of artists formed around Joseph Beuys, and Beuys's trajectory was all too familiar. Born in 1921, he joined the Hitler Youth, attended the Nuremberg Rally. Any of you who've seen those deliriously happy faces of 11-year-old children greeting Hitler in the Triumph of the Will could have seen Joseph Beuys, because he was there doing exactly the same thing, worshiping the Fuhrer. He volunteered for the Luftwaffe, fought as a rear gunner in a Stuka detachment. His plane was shot down over the Crimea. He attributed his survival after severe burns to care by nomadic Tatar tribesmen who covered him in animal fat and felt, and some of these materials are in all of his installations. Whether or not all of this happened is neither here nor there. Beuys recovered and then started teaching abstract art in Dusseldorf. He became, Beuys did, a professor of monumental sculpture, I like that phrase, in Dusseldorf. He lasted for 11 years, and one of his students was Anselm Kieffer. Kieffer, like me, was a child of the last months of the war. He studied with Beuys in 1970 and then developed and went beyond some of Beuys's approaches to the use of natural materials, trees, glass, straw, wood, in paint and sculpture, alongside lead, metal, other materials. But unlike Beuys, he was never accused of avoiding the Holocaust or his own past. These critiques, mostly without any foundation, surrounded Beuys in his later years, but they certainly cannot be applied to Kieffer. Kieffer has addressed the Jewish-German embrace in a host of ways, but to my knowledge, almost never through the human face. This is one of his early drawings about the face of German mysticism. The reason why he doesn't paint the human face is quite clear. He cannot get rid of the face of the Fuhrer, the face of all of the followers saluting him in the Nazi salute. This is a self-portrait of Kieffer in 1968, which he used time and time again to say, we cannot use the face after Hitler took the right to use it from us. This is his particular configuration of it. These are savagely ironic photographs in works of art. He produces a series of books. Kieffer is a bookmaker, bookbinder, a man interested in, as it were, in the morphology of books, how they grow, live, and how they die. There he is again in 1968 with literally his German face effaced in front of us. Now, I want to draw your attention to this particular representation, which is, I think, quite astonishing, because this one is in the St. Louis Museum of Art, and in this work, which he has repeated, to my count, 16 times in different ways, including some notable elements of his Monumenta exhibition in the Grand Palais, where one artist is given the right to fill the Grand Palais, the whole damn thing, and he did it in part through ruins of this kind. Now, what this set of ruins is not only an image of burnt books and burnt libraries, and I'll return to that in a moment, but it is also an interrogation of theodicy. That is to say, in a world where God is all good and God is everywhere, how did evil come into the world? That is the question of theodicy. And Kieffer has turned into an installation the Kabbalistic answer to the question posed. The answer in the Kabbalah is that when God created the universe, and again, we have to think of this metaphorically. I can't get my mind around the spatial idea of God withdrawing from the universe, since God is the universe. But in the Kabbalah, it says, quite straightforwardly, that in the period just before the Big Bang, God withdrew in space in order to create the void in which the universe would be placed. The creative material out of which the world came was contained in vessels, which broke into shards through the force of divine creation itself. Thus, the Big Bang created cutting edges of creative material that fell to the earth, jagged and dangerous, and there they remain as evil in the world. Have a look at Kieffer's installation in the St. Louis Museum of Art entitled The Breaking of the Vessels. I went to see it first with my colleague Peter Gay under the name Fröhlich. He had been a boy in Breslau and saw the Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, and he didn't want to go in. He said, I saw the real thing, why should I see a representation? And I said, I really think you should come with me. And he did, and stayed for the next 4 hours. Because what Kieffer did was to create a representation of the Kristallnacht, see all the broken glass, of the Night of the Broken Glass, in front of a Kabbalistic statement of how evil came into the world. The engagement between, as it were, the Jewish tradition and the German tradition, I think, has no better instance of the double helix that they describe today. Now, in addition, he's done it again. As you can see, this one is in Berlin. And In many respects, what I'd like you to do is to take a look, if I can go back one, there. This is Berlin in the days after the Kristallnacht. I'd just like you to look at the abstract design of the fallen pillars in the center. These are the remains of one of the great libraries near the Oranienbergstrasse synagogue in Berlin. And then I'd like to ask you to just think for a moment about the inner design of Daniel Libeskind Museum of Jewish Art in Berlin. The angle that Libeskind is capturing is the angle of abstraction defining the void left by the removal of the Jewish people of Berlin. And my suggestion is that the installation art of Anselm Kieffer is an attempt to provide an abstract replacement for the human face of Judaism in Europe, which is no longer there. It is not to say that there is no Jewish presence. It is not the same, and certainly not in Germany, as is true in the rest of Eastern Europe. Yes, in recent years, the curators of this museum have filled it with faces of 1,000 years of German Jewish history, but I have to admit that this collection in this museum, admirable, leaves me cold. It's not because of its design or its meticulous representation of a world which has vanished. It's because the building overwhelms its contents. The void sucks into it whatever objects come to fill it. It doesn't have a single straight line, and every time I've been in it, I feel nauseous, literally walking into spaces that have no end, or deliberately cul-de-sac. Now, I think in some respects what we can see is that there's another attempt to talk about the absent presence. This is the Jewish Museum in Berlin of Libeskind, and it could be a decomposed Jewish star, or it could be the lightning bolt that drove the people of Berlin out of it. But it's the design of the museum that you have to traverse through these all kinds of angled and disturbing pathways that leaves, as I say, that leads me into a position that I think is much colder than Kieffer's installations. Now let me simply suggest that this lightning bolt points towards Friedrichstrasse in Berlin, where many of the decisions were taken concerning the murder of the Jews. This design tells us, I think, about the absence of human faces, which is the ultimate meaning of the Holocaust. All right, I'm going to try to offer you a brief conclusion, or really, as the French say, en guise de conclusion. The first point I would like to draw from this brief and very incomplete discussion is that terror has a history. It has a visual history. It is a history filtered through images which change over time. It is not a static image. In the Great War, terror took on the face of the Frontsoldaten, the poilu, Tommy Atkins, those unfortunate men who lived and died in a trench system stretching with various intervals across Europe from Calais to Caporetto and beyond. Those who withstood the terror, who stood their moral ground, as it were, and remained recognizable human beings, these men could indeed be seen as heroes. And yet over time, when war lost its human face, so too did the hero. The cult of the military hero is one of the casualties of the changing face of warfare over the past century. This is not to diminish the extraordinary bravery of men or women, for instance, in the resistance or in later conflicts. It is simply to register a change in both the way war has been waged and how it has been represented. I ask you to take a look at the War Memorial just at the end of Station Road in Cambridge of a returning hero, and you'll see what no longer is possible. In the interwar years, the killing power of the bomber separated those who killed from those who were killed, at least in Europe. Slaughter in China after the Japanese invasion of 1931 and the murderous campaigns of 1937 and after took on older forms, but the bomber changed perceptions of war and broadened the pool of victims trapped in the new technology of destruction. In the Second World War, the face of victimhood changed again. This time, there were millions of foot soldiers who died in combat and millions more civilians who died either under aerial bombardment or in extermination camps. More than half of the victims of the Second World War were civilians. Those who vanished in the Shoah, those who were fed into the machines of assembly line murder, were the victims of a technology of killing, if not new, then one refined and perfected by a kind of demonic Taylorism to an end almost beyond our imagination. When the liberators of the camps disclosed the remains of those trapped in the terror we now call the Holocaust, there were photographs, and yes, there were newsreels to record the moment. We have film, we have photographs of this encounter between Allied soldiers and the strange, unearthly, uncanny creatures who emerged from the camps. But over time, the visual record of what Primo Levi termed the actual injury, the insult to humanity began to fade. There followed a period when the victims of the camps went into the shadows, as my student Peter Lagrue has shown. Only by the 1970s, when the political reconstruction of Europe was complete, was it possible for there to emerge an audience to hear and see the survivors of the camps. As Simone Weil, a victim of Buchenwald, put it at the time, later a great French statesman, until 1970, Auschwitz occluded Buchenwald. Sorry, I'll put it the other way around. Buchenwald, the place of political prisoners, occluded Auschwitz. After 1970, it's the other way around. In all three cases, after the Great War, during the Spanish Civil War, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the image of the victim engraved by very different artists was mediated by the visual technology of the day. Memory is always mediated by language, visual, and symbolic representations, or by cinema. That's the reason why I have chosen these three subjects for the lectures of this series. Photographs provided Dix with the face of war. He then transformed into his own memories. Newsreels gave Picasso what he needed to fire his imagination in such a way as to produce the painting of the century in 4 weeks. Those meditating on the Holocaust initially had the film shot by liberators of the camps left in them, but then went beyond. Over time, I put it to you that the face of the victim of the Holocaust receded from the headlines and the newsreels, and only after 1970 was it possible to recapture that experience. Artists like Anselm Kieffer, architects like Daniel Libeskind, reflected a more general tendency to focus less on the faces of the survivors than on the void left by those who did not survive the Holocaust. Here again, there were parallels with the destruction of the Armenian world in Anatolia, and yet there was a short-lived Armenian Republic, transformed into a Soviet Republic by the 1920s, and further separating the two cases with the emphatic and perverse and ridiculous denial by sequential Turkish governments that the Armenian genocide had happened at all. Clearly, there are multiple explanations for the shift within the work of artists and architects from one set of signifiers, focusing on the human face, to another focusing on ruins and voids. Art has its own rhythms and its own tensions. Clement Greenberg offered an internal explanation of the movement of art towards abstraction in the 20th century. A sense that the figurative realm had been exhausted did move artists to experiment with abstraction in the same way that 12-tone or 8-tonal music emerged with the recognition that it was pointless to try to write Beethoven's 10th Symphony. But what I've tried to do is to suggest that the art of effacement is an important cultural movement. My first claim is simply, as war changed, so did artistic configurations of terror and the victims of terror in wartime. My second claim is more formal. When we move from the Great War to the interwar years and to the Second World War, we can see that the partial occlusion of the human face, or possibly the total of the occlusion of the human face, is one of the most striking features of changing Western European representations of war and terror. There are exceptions, but on balance, the move I have tried to document is one initially away from a naturalistic or expressionistic representation of the human face and figure in artistic meditations on war and terror into other representations. I agree the turn is not universal, and that's why I put aside as well the question of documentary film and photography. My sense is that European and American notions of war have diverged over time, and so have the images and forms artists in Europe and America have used to configure it. My last claim is the most speculative of them all, and I don't expect that I've persuaded you of it. I hope so, but not in 1 hour. It is not only abstraction which frames this shift, it is also a change in the stance of the victims of terror. From the 1970s on, the voices as well as the faces of the victims became central to their representation. They could speak out and be heard. This was in part due to the judicialization of memory, and in part it is a function of the appearance of forms of cheap and reliable technology enabling us to capture and preserve both the voice and the face of the witness. We may not be able to see the Holocaust, but we can hear the stories of those who saw it from within. Thus, I suggest we have come full circle. The construction of dozens of Holocaust archives, starting with the first at my own university, Yale, in 1982. There's the 30th anniversary of the first Holocaust archive, has made a difference in the human cartography of terror. I'd like to leave you with this thought. The face of suffering in times of terror has faded from artistic representations in the century since 1914. But in recent times, the voices recording terror and the faces of the men and women who recall it have been preserved. These voices penetrate the void, people in, and give us some elements of the story and some ways to tell it. The voice, like Alistair Cook's radio, has better faces than many of the representations we have from other sources. Voices penetrate the void, people it, and give us some elements of the story and some ways to tell it. Perhaps we can hear what we cannot see. Perhaps spoken words can convey images unavailable to us in other ways. And if so, then the history of terror needs to be traced not only through the faces, but through the voices of those who knew it from within. Far be it from my purpose to turn the Holocaust Archive into a work of art. Martin Jay, my old friend, made a similar point in his book, Downcast Eyes. He points to a turning away in philosophy and in the arts from the privileging of what we see as a source of knowledge and experience. This insight may have a bearing on how we configure terror. Seeing as believing may be a tag appropriate to the 19th century, but it has its limits in the age of total war, which began nearly a century ago. And so let me close with the image that you see in front of you, the image I began with at the start of this lecture, capturing the message I want to leave with you, to think over, to meditate on. Here are two sculptures, one by Paul Klee, a second by Anselm Kieffer, separated by a century. The first is the Angelus Novus, about which Benjamin wrote his 9th thesis on the philosophy of history. It was given by Klee to Benjamin, who reflected on it, wrote a celebrated 9th thesis, and then gave it to Gershom Scholem, who brought it with him to Jerusalem. And after a court case, is now wound up in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The grandchildren of Benjamin and the grandchildren of Klee of Scholem fought over it. And in a Solomonic conclusion, the High Court in Israel gave it to the Israel Museum instead of dividing it in two. Think about the angel of history of Klee, unable even to close his wings, facing the catastrophe of history, the detritus of which is rising to cover him up. He cannot stem its tide. He is no guardian angel. Klee doesn't show us a guardian angel. He can't protect us. He can't even close his wings. All he can do is to look and bear witness. Klee's angel of 1920 had a face. Kieffer's earthscapes a century later are devoid of them. Kieffer's winged creatures are faceless, with burnt books in their place. Klee's angel of history cannot turn away from this terrifying sight, nor can we. And yet, in Kieffer's latest work, there are so many continuities. Seeing his Sprache der Vögel, which I have liberally translated as birdsong, Pace Sebastian Falk, I wonder if you look at it, you look at the image on the right here in the White Cube exhibition. I wonder if you share my sense of the uncanny echo of Heine's warning that first they burn books and then they burn people. And is it not possible that you hear what I do too at the end of my lecture whenever I look at this extraordinary installation? I hear an echo of Jewish legend. I hear the story of Hanina ben Teradion, burnt at the stake for teaching the Torah in Roman times. When asked by his students, "Rebbe, what do you see?" he answered, "The parchment is burning, but the letters are taking wing." Perhaps the redemptive thrust of this legend, now after the Holocaust, is out of our reach, but thanks to Kieffer, it is not out of our sight. Kieffer, like Klee, gives us this gift, a chance to see total war for what it is, a time when angels are paralyzed in flight or are buried under a pile of ashes and debris entirely filling the sky. Thank you very much.